Hello and welcome to lesson 1.2 in the Python tutorial series 2.0. In our last lesson, what we did is we introduced the for loop and took a look at how a for loop iterates over a string. The same concept is going to appear in lesson 1.2. We're still looking at for loops, but we're going to look at how to use numerical data in your for loops. Look at how to use a new function that hasn't been introduced in this series before, the range function. The range function will allow us to tell our for loops to run a specific number of times. If you have a for loop that you want to run, say 10 times, 100 times, 2 times, it allows us to run a block of code a given number of times. And it allows us to use numerical data in our for loops. So let's go ahead and get started in lesson 1.2, looking at how numbers work in a for loop. So here we are back in our programming environment, and just to kind of look at what we did last time, if we had a string of hello, and we put it into a for loop, I could say for I in string, print I, and run that program. You can see this is nothing new. This is what we did in lesson 1.1. This particular for loop will run a total of 6 times because we have 6 characters in our string. Now, we don't always have to iterate over a string. Sometimes we want to run a block of code a fixed number of times. So let's say I wanted to create a for loop that ran only 5 times. What I would do is I would change this string or variable or whatever it is. I'm going to use a function called the range function. The range function will allow us to communicate to our for loop that we want it to run a fixed number of times. When you type range, it should turn purple to let us know that we have a function in Python. And the argument, in this case, all I'm going to do is put in the argument range 5. Now, it is implied that I'm going to start counting from 0, and I'm going to iterate 5 times. We'll look at some of the other ways we can use the range function, but in its most basic form, that's what we're looking at. So I've got a function here that will run 5 times before printing end. So let's run this program and see what it looks like. And you can see we counted 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, then end. It's something we've talked about before in previous videos, but it's definitely worth mentioning again. Remember, Python always starts counting, or generally starts counting from 0. So when we use the range 5 function, the number 5 is not included in the iterations. When we get to 5, that's the indication that it's time to move out of the for loop and go to any remaining blocks of code. So we did iterate 5 times, that for loop ran 5 times. It just ran 0 through 4 instead of 1 through 5. So just kind of keep that in mind because it's been a while since we've mentioned it. We're going to start counting from 0. Now you can see on the screen that the range function can take up to 3 arguments. If you provide only 1 argument, Python is going to assume that that is a stop value, that we're going to start counting from 0 and we're going to count to 5. If I provide 2 arguments, let's say I'm going to provide 3 and 7. Python's going to assume that with 2 arguments that we're providing a start number and a stop number. If we run this block of code now, Python will start counting inclusive of that starting number. So we'll count to 3, 4, 5, and 6. When we get to 7, that is the indication that this for loop is over, and we'll execute any remaining lines of code that need to be executed in this program. So the range function, you can set a specific range that you want to run. Finally, we can provide a 3rd argument to our range, and that will be what's known as a step value. So if I change this line of code right here to, say I have a range of 10 to 20, step of 2, Python will start counting at 10, inclusive of 10. It will skip 2 numbers each iteration. So we'll go 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and the loop will stop executing when we get to 20. So in this case right here, if we were to run this block of code, we get the numbers 10 through 18 and the end. So that's the basics of the range function right there. If you provide only one argument, it's assumed that that's a stop value counting from 0. If you provide 2 arguments, it's considered a start and a stop value. And if you provide all 3 arguments, Python's going to have a start value, a stop value, and a step value, and any more arguments than that will result in an error when you run your code. Now what we can do is we can start to integrate the range function along with strings to do some interesting things. So some concepts to keep in mind. Let's go back to the fact that we have the string hello. So I'm going to do for I in range, and we'll start 0, so that's an implied 0, and I know I want this to run 6 times because there's 6 characters in hello. If we run this as it is right now, we're going to count 0 through 5 and then end. But instead of printing simply the number, we're going to print the value of string at index location I. You can see over here, we're reprinting our string. That's because each iteration through the range is providing us a number that's an integer value. So the first time through, I is equal to the integer value of 0, and string at index location 0 is this h, so we print the h. String at index location 1 is the lowercase e, and so on. So we iterate 6 times, we end at the exclamation point. If instead of running this range 6 times, we run it 3 times, we're going to get HEL. String at index location 3 is, or string at index location 2 is going to be the final iteration, so it will run 0, 1, then 2, and then when you hit range 3, it's going to stop executing the for loop and go to end. Now this may seem like it's a lot more work than simply iterating through a string, but using this method can allow us to do a couple of interesting things. So first off, if I do for range, and instead of giving it a fixed number, in this case 3, I give it a range, and then the function, the length of string, and then I print string at index location I, so we get hello exclamation point. That's because the length of string is 6, and so this is the exact same as saying for I in range 6. But the advantage to this is if our string changes length, so if I change this back to hello world, this range function will dynamically change the number of times that it runs through the for loop to equal the length of the string. Now where you can start to do interesting things is if I provide this a start value of 0 and an end value of the length of string, there's really no change in when we execute our code. It's implied that we started at 0 anyway. But if I give a step value, in this case a 2, and run this line of code, we're only printing every other character in our string. That's because we're stepping by 2, so we're printing string at index location 0, 2, 4, 6, and so on until we hit the end of our range. This is important because it gives you a little bit more fine-tuned control over iterating over strings. If you just simply do for I in string, there's not a whole lot you can do to alter what's going to be printed or the values. It's going to iterate through the entire string. But when we combine it with the range function and use numbers, it allows us to skip every other letter or skip certain amounts of letters and really fine-tune what we print and what we execute on the screen. You'll see in future lessons that this can be a really powerful tool, and kind of that string manipulation will let us do some neat things in how we present our programs to our user. And that's going to wrap up the introduction to the range function. Now I recognize, similar to the other video, there was probably a pretty simple presentation right there. And quite honestly, there wasn't a lot of practical application, but we are going to get to the point where we use this for loop in some realistic programs instead of just as examples. In the upcoming videos, we're going to look at how iteration works over list variables, how to utilize a for loop to print messages to our user kind of in a more stylized way, particularly if you find that you enjoyed writing little text adventure games. It'll give you an ability to present material to your user with a little bit more flair. And then we're going to write some functions using a for loop that gives us interesting functionality. Probably not super fun functionality, but interesting functionality, like maybe counting vowels in a string. Also upcoming, we're going to look at something called an accumulator that is really powerful when programming some of the smaller games that we've looked at in this series. So I look forward to working with everybody through the coming videos. Of course, if you have any questions about what you saw here or in any of the videos, leave those questions in the comments, and I will certainly do my best to help you out any way that I can. Thank you so much for watching the Python tutorial series 2.0, and have a great day.